While 1.2 million views is an incredible number for a Final Fantasy XIV video, the NoClip documentary is honestly one of these videos that I would hope everybody would see across their time in this game. It covers the journey from 1.0 into 2.0. It covers so much that was so relevant as of 2017 and has continued to be relevant to this day, but the goal today is to sit down and watch it and kind of react to it. I think I know a lot more about the game than I did back when I first watched this. Would have been long ago, and I think that, you know, it'll be good to kind of make sure there's nothing in here I've forgotten or give credit to this when there are things that I feel like I know and I don't know where I know them from. So we're going to watch through these. I have no idea how long it will take me. I assume with the 3 parts being about a 2-hour runtime, I assume it's going to take me about 6 hours to get through. But I am looking forward to this. I am looking forward to getting into here and talking about all the context that NoClip couldn't have known, because we're here in the future. This was published just over 4 years ago.
Square is buried deep into the culture of Japan. Originally a spin-off from Masafumi Miyamoto's father's Powerline construction firm, for over 30 years its games have helped power the rise of Japanese games development. There are no shortage of games that live under the Square Enix banner, but none as big as Final Fantasy. From our Western perspective, there's an air of mythos around the company. The accepted truth behind the series' title is that it was named Final Fantasy as it was Square's make-or-break game to avoid impending bankruptcy. And even if the real answer has more to do with creating an acronym that could be pronounced by both Eastern and Western audiences, it's that first story that gets told. That's the legacy of this series. Stories about adventures that get passed from generation to generation, as nearby as the arcades of Akihabara and as far as the playgrounds of Europe. As the Final Fantasy series has moved from numeral to numeral, there have been high points and low, but with each new game comes the promise of a new story, a new myth. The story of what happened with Final Fantasy XIV is one such myth. What we know about it comes from old reviews, archived message board threads, and through conversations with those who were there. The reason for this is that...
I mean, I will say, over the last 4 years, it has gone well beyond myth. It is told by people who have never played this game. It is told as a beacon of hope for games that have bad launches, for games that seem to not live up to their potential. And so I think the Final Fantasy franchise and Final Fantasy XIV specifically have come to be an example, at least as of today, of what a franchise can do and the impact it can have, and within the MMO space has become a beacon of what leadership and community engagement can look like. Right now, literally having to apologize publicly for not having the ability to serve the sheer number of people that want to log into this game.
That the original version of Final Fantasy XIV doesn't exist anymore. Unlike the vast majority of other old games, there is no way of playing it. It was redacted, painted over. Where once stood a game that threatened to sink the Final Fantasy brand forever, now stands the second most popular subscription MMO in the world. And as the years pass us, the myth of that original version and its incredible redemption story are at risk of disappearing. How did it all happen? How did the same studio that shipped a broken mess turn it all around in 2 years? Why did they make make the decision to keep the old version still alive while secretly working on a brand new game? And how did they manage to make all of this, the redesign and rebirth, part of the game's lore? We knew this was a story worth telling, not only for those who were there to see it all go down, but for the millions of you who have never heard about this, who never...
And I think the idea of deleting and building that into lore isn't new on its own. You know, World of Warcraft Cataclysm redid whole sections of the world, and those were lost until there was Classic. I think what is unique here is just how bad 1.0 got, and how much had to be deleted. And I think it's a sense of scale that makes this take on almost a tall tale, where it just doesn't seem real. It just doesn't seem like they could have actually done that. It feels like 1.0 couldn't have been that thing, that 1.0 is this made up conspiracy that all the players are in on, because it just doesn't get done. It's hard to believe that this really happened.
Never knew the extraordinary lengths the development team went to save this game. So we did just that. Pack your bags, friends. NoClip is heading to Tokyo.
So I think, so when I watched this the first time, this was probably 2018, it'd probably been out and people were like, how have you not seen this? I've been covering the game as a YouTube channel for a year or two. But really still getting my feet wet on, like, what does video editing look like? What in the world is a YouTube algorithm? How does any of this work? I will say that, like, seeing these scenes and seeing Japan, and seeing, you know, like this progression of Final Fantasy cutscenes interjected with a trip to go to Square Enix headquarters, takes on the same meaning as getting to go to my first BlizzCon. Not because that BlizzCon was the greatest BlizzCon ever, but because of what that game and the games around it had come to mean to me. I think the longer you play 14, like, it's just hard to picture how somebody would never, ever, ever want to go to Japan. I think it would be so cool to go see, I don't know. As good as FanFest is in North America, part of me wonders if going to a Japanese FanFest, even though I don't speak Japanese, what that would be like. The language is like the single biggest barrier from being like, yeah, how do I plan on going to something like that? That would be so cool.
Hello and welcome to Shinjuku, Tokyo, home of Godzilla, restaurants full of dancing robots, and Square Enix, one of the most prolific video game companies in the world. For the past few months I've been playing catch up with this story, playing the latest version of the game, talking to players, and watching community retrospective series like the Speakers Network's fantastic Fall and Rise of Final Fantasy XIV. My goal, to make sure we asked the right questions when we sat down with the team. During our time here in Shinjuku, we're going to talk to everyone from the engineers who worked on the original game, to localization leads, community managers, and even the CEO of the company.
I will say that I immediately appreciate somebody that's willing to get their feet wet prior to reporting on the game. Having now covered dozens of interviews every year, it's very, very clear when somebody is not willing to go get some context. It's very clear when some of these reporters don't have any awareness of the game and they make assumptions. It's not as big of a deal when it's just like a YouTuber or a Twitch streamer, but when you start to put an official publication, something that implies like that an editor looked at this, that somebody might have gone to school for this, that there's, you know, some sort of professional code of ethics around the quality of the work you're putting out publicly, I think there's a lot less room for I made a mistake and I'd like to grow. And when you're making a documentary, like, it would be hard if they'd said, having never played this, I'm ready to sit down and learn about all there is. So right on the front end, I think that's a statement that means quite a bit more than it should, I guess.
To allow them the opportunity to tell their side of this fascinating story. The fall and rise of Final Fantasy XIV happened in real time in front of millions of people around the world. But we wanted to know about this story from an entirely new perspective, from inside the corporate machine that made it happen, that led to its terrible launch and ultimately its incredible rebirth.
My name is Michael Christopher Koji Fonks. I am the English localization lead for Final Fantasy XIV. My middle name being Koji, it's not something I gave myself, it's a name my father gave me. My father was stationed in Japan for 2 years in the Navy when he was young. Went back to the States. My mom had me. They wanted to give me a Japanese name. The family was having none of that, so they kind of snuck it in the middle name, but then they always called me Koji. And right. So I guess the joke was on the rest of the family. You know, my dad being in the Navy didn't really learn a lot about Japan other than he really liked Japan, but didn't learn any of the language. So I always knew that my name was Japanese, but beyond that, I really didn't know anything about Japan. But there was always that little seed in there. And then when I got into high school, there's a Japanese class, and I like games. Oh, they make games in Japan. Hey, let me study Japanese. If I study Japanese, I can play all those cool Japanese games that never come out over in America. And it kind of just snowballed from there. When I graduated from high school, I took a trip to Japan for 3 weeks, homestay type of thing, and I fell in love with it. And during that period, I got to visit a lot of schools and a lot of English classes in those schools. And I thought, wow, I could probably I know English, I could do this, will be easy. It wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be, but I studied a couple years at a university in America, then transferred over to Japan, started over 4 years at a university in Japan.
Wow.
Got my teaching license, and yeah.
It's hard work being a teacher.
Yes, I mean, I loved it, but I mean, it was very draining. And that's why pretty much after you'd go to school, 6 in the morning for morning basketball practice, because I was the basketball coach, because as my principal said, hey, you're tall, you're the basketball coach. Then you'd get into classes. I mean, I'd have my homeroom class, then I'd have, 6 or 7 other classes, teaching, then you'd have after school, all of a sudden it's, oh, there's after school basketball, and then you'd get home and you'd correct. So I was really, always at school every day. It was very draining, and I would go home and I would play FF11. It was how I was able to relax, and being able to go into my little room and turn off the lights and put on my headphones and, get into that world of Vana'diel was something that helped me escape.
I will say that teaching in general is an incredible career choice to take you places that you thought you'd never go. It's a great It's a great way to go abroad. So, for anybody considering that, as far as like learning a language though, I don't know that Japanese is the one that I have heard is the easiest. For English speakers, a lot of times you hear, like, here in the U.S., a lot of what we say and use is Germanic based, and so there are a lot. And then, you know, me being from Texas, I'm exposed to a lot of Spanish on, you know, a daily basis on signs and you know, restaurant menus and, you know, somebody walking by on the phone. So I think there's a lot lower hanging fruit than Japanese. So that's quite a seed that was planted for him.
From the stress, and then it just happened to be, you know, one day I was online, you know, checking for 11 related information, and I saw that Square Enix was hiring, looking for a translator, and it just kind of, wow, that would be really cool.
Koji wasn't alone. Final Fantasy XIV was launched in 2010, but the story of this game starts 8 years earlier with the launch of Final Fantasy XI, Square's first MMO, the early days of online. Many of the team who worked on 14 started on 11. One of those was Kasuga-san, who joined the company in 1999 to build a network infrastructure for this fledgling MMO.
自分はネットワークとサーバー担当で入っていて、なので一番最初にやっていたのが、当時プレイステーション2で初めて、厳密にはドリームキャストがその前にあるんですけれども、プレイステーションプラットフォームとしては、オンライン要素が入った初めての時期だったので、プレイステーション2でネットワークを作るために、TCP/IP のドライバーを作ったりとか、まだ当時モデム通信の時代だったんで、PPP 通信とか、あと ADSL がちょうど普及し始めた時期だったんで、ADSL の認証として使われた PPPoE とかっていう、その本当にネットワークの下の部分、今だとあんまし誰も書かないようなところを書くっていう担当で入社してました。
EF に関して言うとね、スクエアエニックスっていいますか、スクエアが初めて、オンラインのあれだけの規模の、MMORPG 日本でやるっていうのはもう本当初めてだったんで、いやもう正直いろんなことがありましたね、当時ね。こんな言っちゃっていいのかな、言っちゃっていいのOK なのいいんだまずね、どういうことがあったかというと、あの時はMMO とかね、海外で例えばウルティマとかそういった先行事例があるんですけど、基本的に PC ですよね。ところがだから今週末でやるなんてもう無謀の極みだとかってね、もうたくさんそういう。
Early MMO days did feel like they were a little bit by the seat of their pants, so it's not shocking to hear that somebody feels like there was something going on that was just winging it. You know, there's a huge risk in your career going into something that's never been done, that maybe there's a reason it's never been done, but there's also a huge opportunity to be on the ground floor of something. So I think taking this risk, I think there are a lot of stories untold of companies that have backstories just like this, where they were taking a risk to come into the space and do something that hadn't been done, dealing with online interaction or something like that. And the reason those stories aren't told is because they didn't experience success.
いうふうに言われました。ソニーさんがPS2 のハードディスク BB キットなんかもですね、もう何台出すんだとか安堵がついて、そういうのを吸ったもんだしていろんなことがありましたんで、ほとんど不可能だとかでよく言われてましたよ、実際には。成功なんて。
XI was my first MMO. I hadn't played one before. I remember purchasing the PlayStation 2 broadband unit because they were all sold out. I ended up paying double on like some Yahoo auction or something like that. Ridiculous, but I had to play it. We got a new internet connection. We were on a regular modem at that time, but because we needed a new modem, we had to upgrade to ISDN 128. But yeah, it was definitely worth it. It was something that was completely new to me, but fascinating. And ever since then, I've been into MMOs. That was the gateway drug for me.
Yeah, I think the first MMO you ever play will always have a special place in your heart because it breaks so many barriers. The first time I logged into the World of Warcraft and I saw other people, my very first character started in Teldrassil. Even though you guys may know me as a Horde player, my very first ever created character was a Night Elf Druid. And being in Teldrassil and fighting one of those little level 1 or 2 cats, and there being another player help me kill that cat, that was just so many new experiences simultaneously. Now, being level 1 and having to go kill a couple of level 1 things, it's like, well, no, go pick up the quest, kill your 5 things, turn it in, blast through to level 5, you'll be level 5 in a few minutes. But no, I was running aimlessly. I was just excited to be in a world, like in what felt like a real world. I felt like I'd stepped outside of my home. And so I think there is something passionate about anybody's first experience with an MMO. And if that MMO does it right, they can have a loyalty to that memory that probably lasts in some form of itself for the rest of that player's time playing video games. I think it's where my fondness and that kind of beacon of hope that World of Warcraft, maybe through some substantial changes, maybe through personnel changes, maybe through ownership changes, I don't know, but that it could get back to that magic. And I don't know that that magic's even a real thing. I think I just want it to be a place where other new players can experience what I experienced. And whatever it takes to get there is something that I hope for.
Going in from FF11 and then trying, some of the Western MMOs as well, getting into World of Warcraft, seeing the differences between the two.
Personally, I think it's very different, here in Japan from the Western market because, it is for everyone in the globe. It's very first MMORPG on the console, PlayStation 2. And also, it was the first ever cross-platform MMO between PlayStation 2 and the Xbox 360. The obvious one is the most Japanese people don't very like to chat in public.
Right.
So, in the world, there's a lot of characters, but it's very quiet because people are using a tell instead of the say or shout. And then, but if you go to the Western world, game world, every single one is shouting around. So that's a huge difference.
While in the West, you have your EverQuests and you had your Ultima Onlines. In Japan, there was none of that. And then, so Final Fantasy XI was really one of the first MMOs in Japan. And so getting to work with basically the pioneers of the Japanese MMO was really exciting. On the other hand, you could also say that it was possibly kind of a curse in the sense that they were all, doing their own thing. They had their vision of what an MMO should be and what a Japanese MMO should be. And then me, again, not having played an MMO before, getting on this team and thinking, okay, this is an MMO and translating away and working in that project, I kind of, started thinking, okay, this is what an MMO is, this is what an MMO is. And then that one day I start playing WoW and it's like, oh, seeing the differences between the two and saying like, okay, what I thought was the norm in Final Fantasy XI, the grinding for 20 hours to go up one level and then only to have your level drop when you pull too many crabs and it kills you and you've lost 5 hours work. Like, I thought that was normal. And then
the grind was normal. So like my first level 60 character was like 17 and a half days of playtime. So the grinding was normal. It's the loss. Taking your experience away, that more hardcore, that fear of death, is very different from game to game, especially back in early games. What happens when you die? What is the concept of durability? Does it take time? In WoW, you have to run back to your body. If you die a bunch rapidly, is there an additional penalty that's absorbed by a game? In modern day, not where they started, but in modern day right now, Retail WoW and Retail 14 have more in common than any other game in the world has in common with either one of them. I think I would be willing to almost argue that WoW Classic has less in similarities than with Shadowlands than Shadowbringers does in some ways. I think that they've become shockingly similar. Now, their execution and all of that is where the differences lie, but if you just made a feature list of what's inside them and what the objectives are and who they appeal to, they are very, 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 very similar. And I think that any of the areas that there are differences, there's probably overlap with other games. And so when you start to say, okay, maybe World of Warcraft's PvP doesn't align with Final Fantasy's PvP because Final Fantasy's PvP is just way less developed than WoW's. Okay, well then maybe in that one aspect you go relate it to what's going on in another game's PvP. With the amount of story being told, I think Shadowlands has tried very, very, very hard to tell what they call a campaign story, a main story that drags you through the zones in order. And then you have these exploratory groups that each have their own stories that help fuel the main one. And that all starts to sound a lot like a main scenario quest from Final Fantasy. Obviously, they're not as developed at it. They're not as good at it. But the ideas, right? The ideas behind it feel very, very, very similar. And then it's the execution, and it's the communication, and the community including both the devs and the players. That wholesome word community is where I think the differences are right now. And I think a lot of that centers on, consistent patch cycles versus content drought. Actions that make it feel like they're listening versus actions that make it feel like they're not, whether or not they actually both are. I think that these games are very, very, very similar. If you're looking from outside of MMORPGs, I think if you say to a WoW player or a 14 player who only plays that one and maybe doesn't like the other one that these games are similar, that's almost an offensive statement. They're like, what are you talking about? They're nothing alike. They're nothing alike. But when you compare that to other MMOs in the space, when you compare that to single-player RPGs, when you compare that to other genres altogether, maybe you're playing platformers or racing games or shooting games, these games have a lot of the same structure. And they hide it behind different aesthetic styles, they hide it behind different content cycles, they hide it behind different relationships between content. If you have 2 or 3 similar features, the way they interact with each other is different across the games. So they're definitely different executions, but I think they are different executions of the same recipe.
Like, well, that's not normal, is it? The Japanese base game, Final Fantasy XI, had already released, and they were working on the first expansion pack, Rise of the Zalart. I was part of the team that was working to get the base game and Rise of Zalart all translated before the Japanese Rise of Zalart was finished, so we could all release at the same time.
Right. Did you get it on time?
I got it on time. I haven't missed a deadline yet. That's one thing I'm proud of.
Final Fantasy XI was a huge success for Square Enix. It established a concurrent user base of around 250,000 players for years. It was the most profitable Final Fantasy game ever, and at one stage was the 6th most popular game on all of Xbox Live. More than that, it established the Japanese style of MMO, and when the decision was made in 2005 to start work on a sequel,
I wanted to play 11 back in the day, and my parents wouldn't let me play an online game. And I don't remember how we talked them into letting us play World of Warcraft, because I was still living at my parents' house when World of Warcraft launched. So I don't remember exactly how the timing on that worked out, but something about paying for online interaction with the one, it just, I don't know. Something.
The new MMO was built around things that made 11 successful, focusing, like most Final Fantasy games do, on beautiful graphics and an interesting battle system. This new game was to be directed and produced by the same duo that shipped 11, series veteran Hiromichi Tanaka and Nobuaki Komodo. Final Fantasy XIV was announced for Windows and PlayStation 3 in 2009, but behind the scenes the development team was struggling to put the pieces of its new world together.
Ooh.
That's a good point to take break number 1.